Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to our weekly program from the book Genesis. We're studying the miracles in the gospel. And today we will be staying with chapter 15 and focusing on resurrections. We will be discussing items 37 through 40. So welcome everyone to Kardec Radio, where we're nourishing our souls always. It's such a pleasure, such an honor to be here and sharing this information with you, which is something that we have been taking with us for many years, for thousands of years. And finally, thanks to Spiritism, it becomes clear to us that the miracles that we thought were miracles are not really miracles. They can actually be completely explained thanks to the new spiritual science that Allan Kardec is inviting us to understand. And so today we will be talking about Jairus' daughter and the son of the widow from Nain. And before we actually go into the cases, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little screen sharing here and go over the behind the scenes information, so to speak, so that we understand it better. So that is our key, right? We're here to understand. So let us do the slideshow, play from start. And we're guessing you will see it. We'll do a quick check just to make sure that the program is aired with the pictures. Let's just see for a moment here. Okay, it's lagging behind, but it seems like we are on the air. Yes. Okay, good. Perfect. You can see it. So what is behind these two cases is catalepsy. And before we go into the case, let us go back in Genesis and let us look at the definitions. So first of all, the definitions from the dictionary for lethargy, and there's a difference between catalepsy and lethargy, is as follows. So lethargy is a pathological state of sleepiness or deep unresponsiveness and inactivity. So we probably have all experienced times in our lives where we felt lethargic, sometimes due to illness, but sometimes also due to emotional or mental issues. But anyway, now we know it's labeled a pathological state, and it's a form of drowsiness, sleepiness, we're inactive. Now, in contrast, catalepsy is a medical condition that's characterized by a trance or seizure with a loss of sensation and consciousness, and it's accompanied by rigidity of the body. So this is really important. So catalepsy is also a medical condition. Before they said pathological state, but this is a medical condition characterized primarily by a trance or seizure. And this is key. There is loss of sensation in the body and loss of consciousness. And it's accompanied by a rigidity of the body, right? So very easily we can already guess it can be mistaken for death. And of course, in the old days, there weren't any machines that would be able to measure whether somebody was really had really discarnated or not. We can imagine that it was mistaken many times. So the summary of the catalepsy, so to speak, from the Spirit's book, which is linked to the definition, is catalepsy is a condition that occurs in a variety of physical and psychological disorders, and it is characterized by the lack of response to external stimuli, as we just heard from the regular off the website definition. So it's a lack of responsiveness to external stimuli, muscular rigidity, and fixity of posture. So the person is completely stuck. So the limb remains in whatever position they are placed, right? We can easily imagine how that looked like. So what happens there is an interruption of the transmission of sensations to the sensory center, which is our spirit. So the sensory center is our spirit, and it's produced in the perispiritual fluid. So the interruption of the transmission of sensation to the sensory center is produced in the perispiritual fluid. And that happens, usually it flows, and we feel all the sensations. But in catalepsy, there is an interruption. And the nerves are the conductors. So there's no sensation, there's this rigidity. So let us see. So as long as the thread of the connection has not been broken, however, so this is just a temporary interruption, but as long as the thread of the connection hasn't been broken, the spirit hasn't discarnated yet. And it can, through energetic actions of its own will, or through the equally powerful outside fluidic influx from another spirit, be called back to the body. Right? So here the body goes into, because of seizure or whatever other reason, there's this temporary interruption of the stimuli to the spirit via the nerves so that the body can move and feel sensations. And it can be easily mistaken as death, but it would only be so-called death if there was a rupture between, of course, if the perispirit had disconnected, if the body had been disconnected from the perispirit. So the bond between the perispirit and the body would have been, all the molecules had been disconnected. That's discarnation. But in catalepsy, that's not the case. All right. So, and as a result, either the spirit itself can call itself back through its own will, or it can happen through the fluidic influx from the outside. So here's the difference between the lethargy and the catalepsy. And we find this in question 424 in the Spirit's book. And you're invited to read it, because this is just taking pieces out of it so that we understand these cases that these so-called miracles that we're going to discuss in a minute better. So lethargy and catalepsy have the same principle, which is the temporary loss of sensitivity and motion, right? So when we go back to the other slide here, lethargy is sleepiness or unresponsiveness in activity. Differs from catalepsy, which is the rigidity. It's based on seizure or trance. And so when we go forward again, they do have the same outward manifestation, which is a temporary loss of sensitivity and motion by the body. So in lethargy, the suspension of the vital forces are generalized. And that gives the body the appearance of death. And it always happens naturally. It's never induced. So lethargy, this is really important. The suspension of the vital forces are generalized. It's not just one little area. It's all of it, right? So it's all of it. And it's never induced. It happens naturally for whatever reasons, right? There's many. And then in catalepsy, the suspension of the vital forces is localized. It can either have an effect on a larger part of the body or smaller part, right? So the intelligence in that moment of catalepsy is free to express itself, which is interesting. And that can be as a spirit, right? I mean, The spirit is the intelligent principle of the universe, right? So we have to see it in that way, and not necessarily imagine that the body, the person appears to be dead, right? But the spirit is free to express itself. Sometimes spontaneous or artificially induction is the cause for catalepsy. So it can be artificially induced, or it happens spontaneously, in contrast to lethargy, which happens naturally. But catalepsy can be undone by magnetic action, and lethargy, of course, too, right? So we can snap out of it, so to speak. One catalepsy example outside of the gospel, and I'm sure you all know it, is in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet tragedy. And what happened there is that the kindly Friar Lawrence, in the course of a botched attempt to help the lovers, provides Juliet with a catalepsy-inducing potion so effectively that Romeo tragically imagines his beloved's death like trance to be actual death. So Romeo mistakes that induced catalepsy state that Juliet is under. So he mistakes it as a death and poisons himself in despair just before she awakens from her stupor. Wow. So it's a complete mistake there, right? And that's leading her to kill herself with his dagger upon discovering his suicide. So it's like a complete domino effect here. And it's just curious, it's interesting to see another example of catalepsy. All right. So I'm going to get out of here so we can see whether there's any questions. So I want to connect with you. Oh, there we are. Okay, let's see who is all here. Yes. Hi, Mark. Thank you for joining. Hi, Nora, dear friend. Thank you for joining too. Thank you, Teresa, for being here. And there's a few more. So I think we understood what catalepsy and lethargy are all about, right? Which is important for understanding the so-called miracles. But before we go there, let's go to question 422 in the Spirit's book. 422, which is, by the way, in a subchapter entitled, hold on just a second. There it is. Why are we having a problem? Okay, so the subchapter, so it's in the Emancipation of the Soul, chapter 8 in the Spirit's book, and it's question 422. And that subchapter is entitled Lethargy, Catalepsy, and Apparent Death. So beautiful how these books all work together, right? We can always cross-reference. So I want to go to 422 and read it real quick. So here it is. Lethargic and cataleptic individuals, right, the two we just talked about, generally see and hear what is occurring around them, but they cannot express it. So that's the free expression of the spirit, right? Do they see and hear through the eyes and ears of the body? So when somebody is in a lethargic or cataleptic state, they can still hear and and observe what's occurring around them, but does it happen through the eyes of the body? The answer is no. It comes through the spirit. The spirit is conscious, but is unable to communicate. Why is it unable to communicate? Answer, the state of the body prevents it. It's all rigid, right? The peculiar state of the organs proves to you that there is something more to a human being than just a body. Because although the body is not functioning, the spirit continues to act. And of course, we knew that, right? We know. But it's interesting to know that the spirit is active during the lethargic or cataleptic state. So question 423, in the state of lethargy, can the spirit separate itself entirely from the body in such a way as to give the body all the appearances of death? And then return to it? So Alan Kardec is wondering, can the spirit separate itself entirely from the body and yet return to it? The answer is the body is not dead in the lethargic state because there are functions that continue to operate. It's just a temporary rigidity or lack of responsiveness of stimuli that are not being transferred, so to speak. They're not carried to the spirit. Vitality remains in a latent state, like in a cocoon, but it is not extinguished. The spirit is always connected to the body while the body is alive. But once the ties are broken by real death and by the decomposition of the organs, the separation is complete and the spirit no longer returns. Right? Makes sense. Once all the ties are severed, molecule by molecule, the connection between the physical form and the perispirit, that's the only time so-called death has occurred. When an apparently dead person comes back to life, it is because death had not actually been consummated. So that's the key. And that was the mistake that peoples in the past made, mistaking death, catalepsy or lethargy for death. And then they thought it was a miracle. But that can't be. It's not, it's like science, you know, it's not logic. It doesn't make sense. And Alan Kardec helps us to understand that. So let's see, there's one more. Through care given in time, can one strengthen the ties that are about to break and bring back to life a person who without such attention would definitely die? So could one, through one's own attention, bring somebody back who would actually, under normal conditions, die? And the answer is yes, of course. You have evidence of this every day. In such cases, magnetism is often a powerful means because it gives the body the vital fluid needed to keep its organs functioning. We remember from the healings that healings happen because there's a fluidic exchange. Healthy fluids replace the unhealthy fluids. And that is really what's happening here. Magnetism is this fluid exchange. And we learned there's the suction and there's the suction pump and there is also the infusion pump or whatever the word was, right? It either will give it or take it. But it's this fluidic exchange, and that's the magnetism they're talking about. So, yes, of course, we can make a huge difference to magnetism, right? As long as the ties aren't all severed. So this is Spirit's book, so you're welcome to look a little bit deeper into that. And now let us go, finally, yay, to Genesis. And we're turning to page, let's see here. We're still in chapter 15 and page 339, if you'd like to follow along. It's entitled Resurrections, and we're looking at Jairus' daughter. So this is from the Gospel. Okay, so let us sit back and get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us now look at these so-called miracles with a different eye. Jesus again crossed over by boat to the other side, and a large crowd gathered around him as soon as he was close to the sea. And a head of the synagogue named Jairus came looking for Jesus, and finding him, he threw himself at his feet. So Jairus is throwing himself at his feet, and he's begging vehemently, saying, I have a daughter who is about to die. Come and put your hands on her in order to heal her and save her life. Jesus went there with him, followed by a large crowd who pressed around him. So Jesus instantly followed and went towards the girl's house, towards Jairus' house where the girl was. And he had a large crowd around him. While Jesus was still speaking, some of the head of the synagogue's house came and said to him, Your daughter is dead. So the head of the synagogue's house came to Jairus and said, while Jesus was there, Your daughter is dead. Why do you want to put the master to the trouble of going any further? Upon hearing this, however, Jesus said to the head of the synagogue, Do not be troubled. only believe. So Jesus said, do not be troubled, only believe. And he allowed no one to accompany him except for Peter, James, and John, James' brother. So this is, as an aside, interesting to note. At first, he is approaching the house with a multitude of people surrounding him. And then, when he hears that somebody says the daughter has already died, and he says, do not be troubled, only believe, which was pointing towards something positive and optimistic going on, right? But he only took 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. So we often hear that Jesus shared the deepest secrets only with the disciples. He spoke differently to the disciples than the multitudes. So here too, he's using those who were more initiated than the rest. Anyway, so it's just interesting to note. Having arrived at the home of the head of the synagogue, he saw a distraught group of people who were crying and wailing. Entering the home, he said to them, why are you making so much noise, and why are you crying? The girl is not dead, she's only sleeping. They scoffed at him. Having made everyone leave, he has everyone leave, right? It's like he's getting closer and closer to fulfilling the work with focus. So he was alone now. Having made everyone leave, he took the child's father and mother and those who had come with him, and he went into the place where the girl was lying. So he went with the family. He took her hand and said, Talita Kumi, that is, my child, I order you to get up. At that instant, the girl got up and began walking. She was 12 years old, and they were marvelously astonished. We find this in Mark 5:21 to 24 and 35 to 43. It's not a miracle, right? We understand what happened. Jesus knew that it must have been a lethargic or cataleptic state, and that with his will, by calling her back with magnetism, by a magnetism of fluid exchange, she would be back to normal, so to speak, because the ties hadn't severed yet, and he saw that. He knew that. Before we go to what Allan Kardec says, we're going to cover one more miracle, and that is the son of the widow from Nain or Nain. The next day, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples accompanied him with a large crowd of people. Can we imagine? Jesus going from situation to situation, always surrounded by a large crowd of people. Wow. That in itself can be intense, right? No privacy, nothing. When he was close to the city's gate, a dead person was being readied for burial. He was the only son of his mother, who was a widow, and a large number of people from the town were with her. When he saw her, the Lord was touched with compassion and said to the woman, "Weep no more." Then, approaching the coffin, he touched it, and those who were carrying it stopped. Then Jesus said, "Young man, I order you to get up." Immediately, he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. All those present were taken with fear and glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has appeared in our midst, and God has visited his people." Word of his miracles spread throughout Judea and all the neighboring regions. Word of this miracle, right? It appears miraculous. Wow, somebody's in a coffin, is dead. Jesus comes and touches the man, the coffin, and says, "Get up." And there he gets up. And that's so beyond us. No, we can't do that. We're like helpless when it comes to this, right? Not so. Jesus told us we can do everything he did, and even more so. So now that we're understanding what happened there, again, it was his willpower with his intention. He saw that the ties hadn't been severed completely yet between the body and the perispirit in this young man. And he did this magnetic fluid exchanging action and commanded him to get up. And that's what it was. Now let's see what Allan Kardec says to this, right? The occurrence of the return to corporeal life by a truly dead individual would be contrary to the laws of nature and consequently miraculous. So we know that all the spiritual laws fall under the law of nature or God's laws. There's the material, God's material laws, and there's God's spiritual laws. So once the ties are all severed, for a spirit, for these ties to be reconnected, that is against God's laws. It can't be explained. So that would be a miraculous event. But when the ties are unsevered yet, and it's just a mock death, so to speak, it's an appearance of a death, then it can be magnetically normalized. The person can go back to its sensation transference. However, it is not necessary to resort to that order of phenomena to explain the resurrections performed by Christ. So in other words, Allan Kardec says, no, it's not a miracle. We're not going there because we know it can be explained. If appearances sometimes deceive even professionals nowadays, instances of this sort must have been much more frequent in a country where no precautions were taken and where burial was immediate. There was a time in the history of mankind where actually little bells were installed in the coffins so that those who were mistakenly buried could ring this bell. Can we imagine that? But we can because, modern medicine has really done a lot of good in that regard. So much more advanced, right? To actually really make sure that somebody has discarnated. So there's an example that Allan Kardec gives us, and he says that proof of this custom that people were buried too prematurely may be found in Acts 5:5. And he says, when Ananias heard these words, he fell over and gave up his spirit. And all who heard about it were taken with great fear. Immediately, some young men came to get his body, and after wrapping it, they buried it. Boom, that's how quickly it went. Around 3 hours later, his wife, Sapphira, who did not know what had happened, came in. And Peter said to her, at that very moment, and that's ... So they're not giving us the whole story. We can read it in Acts 5:5. At that very moment, she fell at Peter's feet and gave up her spirit. The young men entered, found her dead, and wrapping her, they buried her together with her husband. Wow. So that's pretty stark, isn't it? So Jesus himself obviously said this about Jairus' daughter. The girl is not dead, but is only asleep. So now we know why. It's a sort of sleep, right? It's this lethargic, cataleptic state where the sensations, the transference of the stimuli is not happening. And that's why Jesus said, the girl is not dead, but is only asleep. As a consequence of the fluidic power that Jesus possessed, there is nothing surprising that this vivifying fluid, directed by a powerful will, had reanimated numbed senses. We know that the more elevated a soul is, the more pure the perispirit is. And in Jesus' case, of course, it was the most purified perispirit to walk the earth, so to speak. And with that much power that Jesus had and the purity of his soul, of course, he was able to infuse the pure, because when we're in the healings, when we learned about the healings, was the purer the perispirit, the more powerful and more quickly healing can happen. And also, lethargy or catalepsy can be put to an end because it's this force that's coming towards them, and the purity of the perispirit exchanging the unhealthy fluids with the healthy fluids. And that's what Alan Kardec is talking about here. As a consequence of the fluidic power that Jesus possessed, there is nothing surprising that this vivifying fluid of his, directed by a powerful will, had reanimated numbed senses. That he had even been able to call back to the body, as long as the perispiritual tie was not definitely broken, the spirit that was ready to abandon it. So again, it can be done. So if we ever are faced with someone who appears dead and in cataleptic state, maybe we can offer our fluid, like in passes, right? Or get the support of good spirits. So it's a little mental note for set to self, right? So we can, because we have powers in that regard too, not like Jesus, obviously. But it's good to know the mechanism so we can apply it if needed, right? So where are we? For people at that time who believed a person was dead as soon as the breath stopped, there was a resurrection, and they could affirm it in good faith. So that's what they called resurrection. However, in reality, there was a healing and not a resurrection in the true meaning of the word. It's fantastic, isn't it? It's so fascinating to understand the mechanisms behind it. It just gives us more insight, but also more power, more understanding. It's just all around opens our scope so much. And of course, it helps us to understand Jesus better, right? And the time and the times he lived in. So it's really fantastic. So no matter what may be said, the resurrection of Lazarus in no way invalidates this principle. So we know about that, right? It is stated that he had been in the tomb for 4 days. Lazarus was for 4 days in the tomb. However, it is well known that there are lethargies that last 8 days or more. So that's also interesting information, right? So there's lethargies that last 8 days or more. And Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days. One might add that Lazarus already smelled bad, which is a sign of decomposition. This allegation also proves nothing, according to Alan Kardec, keeping in mind that in certain individuals there is partial decomposition of the body even before death, and they give off a rotten smell. Yes. So it didn't really mean that much that he gave off a rotten smell, because it can happen. Death arrives only when the organs essential to life are stricken. And who could affirm that Lazarus in fact smelled rotten? It is his sister Martha who says so. But did she know it for a fact? Lazarus had been buried for 4 days, so she assumed it, but there was no way she could have been certain. So this is what Alan Kardec tells us, that the smell part, we don't know, right? But it's still, Lazarus's situations can still fall into lethargy, because lethargy apparently can last for 8 days. And here is another incident that he gifts us with, that Alan Kardec gives us, that will give us further proof. The following incident proves that decomposition sometimes precedes death. In the Covenant of the Good Shepherd, founded in Toulouse by Penal Colony Chaplain Abbot Marine for repentant women, there was a girl, So in this institution, a penal colony like a prison for repentant women in an abbot in France, there was a girl who had borne the most horrible sufferings with the composure and impassiveness of an expiatory victim. So there was a girl, and she was very patient. She took all the pain very patiently. In the midst of her pain, she seemed to smile as if she were having a heavenly vision. Like Saint Teresa, she asked to suffer even more, her flesh in tatters and gangrene destroying her limbs. Out of wise foresight, the doctors had recommended that they enter the body right after death. How strange! As soon as she let out her last breath, the whole process of decomposition stopped. The cadaver's exhalations ceased, and for 36 hours she remained exposed to the prayers and veneration of the community. So here Allan Kardec wants to show us, wants to prove with another case that the smell of rottenness, of rotten flesh, can very well happen before discarnation. So it's not our clue that the ties between the body, the physical body, and the perispirit have all been severed. In other words, the death has occurred. Because here in the case of this girl who was horribly abused and actually discarnated, she had gangrene, so she was decomposing. But when she actually discarnated, that smell stopped. She probably had some beautiful connection that allowed her to be for 36 hours exposed to prayers and veneration of the community. It's probably some intervention happening. But the point Allan Kardec is making to us is the smell of rotten flesh is not proof of death. What a conversation, right? All right, so let us go. There's a reference here to chapter 14, number 29, because that ties into what we're studying here. So we're going to 29. And we're revisiting now that we've talked about these cases, now that we know what these cases are and what they were about. Miracles, it's better than cases. Let's go back to what Allan Kardec helped us to understand about catalepsy and resurrection. So if we really firmly connect ourselves knowledge-wise with these so-called miracles, which are not miracles. So first of all, and we've gone over this, but it's good to rehearse it. Inert matter cannot feel, right? We know that. Lamp, table, pen cannot feel, nor can the perispiritual fluid. So the perispiritual fluid, but on its own, cannot feel either. And of course, inert matter can't feel. And once the perispiritual fluid is disconnected from the physical form, then the body becomes inert matter again and can't feel, right? However, the latter, meaning the perispiritual fluid, transmits sensation to the sensory center, which is the spirit. So the perispiritual fluid can't feel on its own, but it transmits the sensations to the spirit. So that's the transmitter. Painful corporeal lesions thus impact the spirit like an electric shock through the intermediation of the perispiritual fluids, because the spiritual fluid transmits the sensations to the spirit, for which the nerves seem to be the conducting wires. So this is that's the mechanism of pain transmission, of sensation transmission, not just pain, also pleasure, any sensation really. The stimuli happens, and the perispiritual fluid is the conductor that brings the sensation to the spirit via the nerves. Excuse me. Via the nerves, which are the conductors. So this is really fascinating, right? So then when an interruption takes place, it can take place due to the separation of the limb or the cutting of a nerve. That's one way, right? The hand is off and then there is no sensation. That makes sense, right? I mean, that's pretty coarse. It's easy to understand. Or we're cutting a nerve. Sometimes, we cut ourselves in the finger, and in the process, we cut a nerve, and for the rest of our lives, we won't have any sensation in that finger, for example. But also partially or generally, so this interruption can take place due to the separation of a limb or the cutting of a nerve, but also partially or generally and without any lesion in the moments of the spirit's emancipation, great overexcitement, or preoccupation. So this interruption of the sensations of pain or pleasure or any stimuli that get transmitted by the perispirit via the nerves, this interruption can have different causes. One is a lesion on the body, some kind of a wound, but it can also be, of course, death, right? That's easy to understand, but it can also be overexcitement or preoccupation, right? So we can, for example, hurt ourselves, but our focus is totally somewhere else, that we're actually not really in touch with it. I'm sure you've been there, right? I know I have. Where the focus, the mind is just completely somewhere else, and the sensations, also with hunger, even as simple as feeling hungry. If we're totally preoccupied with something else, we're not in touch so necessarily with our stomach, right? We just don't feel it so much. Yes. So that's one key to overcome feelings of appetite, right? To occupy ourselves so that we are, it's a preoccupation, right? So that this interruption of the sensations will happen. In this state, the spirit no longer thinks of the body, and in its feverish activity attracts to itself, so to speak, the perispiritual fluid, which in withdrawing from the surface produces a momentary numbness. So if we focus on something so strongly, the perispiritual fluid gets withdrawn from the surface where the sensation is, or from our stomachs, or wherever the sensation is from, and consequently creates this temporary interruption. We just don't feel it. Isn't that, it's very, we've talked about it, we're just going over it again, to understand on a new and even deeper level of what happens behind the scenes in catalepsy or lethargy, right? One could further state that in certain circumstances, a molecular modification is produced in the perispiritual fluid, and this modification temporarily deprives it of its transmitting ability. He does not define how this modification looks like, but we just take it at face value, so that the perispirit somehow gets modified. We know already it can retract. Maybe that's part of the modification, so that it isn't really capable of completing its transmission work of sensations via the nerves. That is why many times in the heat of battle, a soldier does not notice that he has been wounded. That a person whose attention is concentrated on an endeavor does not hear the noise, right? How often? And then when we tune in, we can't even breathe anymore. It's so noisy. It's just so annoying. But then when we're totally absorbed with something else, boom, it happens. Does not hear the noise that is spread all around. It is an analogous effect. So, dear friends, that's really, there's more to this chapter, but we don't want to read the whole. I mean, you're welcome to revisit the, chapter 14. It's in the fluids, catalepsy, resurrection. It's items 29 and maybe 30 also. But I hope it's clear, so we understand catalepsy better. We definitely know it's not the so-called resurrection that we've studied in these two examples. Actually, there were more like 4, are not miracles. And it's not a true resurrection because a resurrection is not something that is possible under the natural law or law of God. Once the ties are severed, the spirit can't go back into the same body. But if it's catalepsy, which is or lethargy, which is a temporary stop of the sensation transmission to the spirit, which either manifests through just limbness, looks like a state of sleep, or even with total rigidity. That can be through magnetic action, which means one fluid gets exchanged with the others through the willpower and the purity of the perispirit. Then the person can be woken up again, so to speak. All right, dear friends, next week we will continue, and it'll be getting exciting, even more exciting. Let me I lost the page here, but we're going to talk about something that is very often, second here. Why is it so difficult to find this? Yes, the multiplication of the loaves, and Jesus calms the storm, and the wedding at Cana. So this is going to be Jesus walking on the water. So this will be very exciting to understand what happens behind the scenes. I'm so happy you guys joined me because it's so much more fun to do this together, to learn together. And I'm grateful for Kardec Radio and for all the mentors. And we thank, of course, God and Jesus and Allan Kardec and all the spirits that work together with Allan Kardec and all the spirits that work together with Kardec Radio and our own mentors. Thank you for the guidance and thank you for joining. And we're wishing you a beautiful solstice. What an incredible time to be alive on planet Earth. I'm hoping that you will be incredibly in tune with this transition that we're going to experience. We're already almost in it. And of course, very happy holidays. And for those, Merry Christmas. And we will see you, so God willing, next Sunday, same time, same place. God bless you. Bye, friends.